Thank you for being here. I'm super excited to talk about all things resilience and stigma, and I'm going to check the time to make sure I don't go over. So today I'll tell you a little bit about my lab, what we do, who we are, and also I'll give you some examples of specific projects we've published to date, and then I will talk about some implications, some things that we can all do to be a bit more resilient. So my lab researches a number of different interrelated topics, and those include resilience, right? So overcoming adversity, which I'll talk more about what I mean by that. We also study identity, so who we are, the groups that we identify with, and also how we are categorized by others. And in doing that, we conduct different types of studies. So we do field studies, as was shared. I am in organizational psychology, so I'm really fascinated by organizations. I study employees, and my goal overall is to generate in that lab research and disseminate our findings to help employees thrive and really enjoy the work that they do, because we all spend so much of our life at work, and also to improve workplace experiences and processes. So as I shared, today I want to talk about resilience, and I want to talk about some bones I have to pick with the resilient space, and then I want to talk about stigma. So stigma is a characteristic or identity that is deemed less worthy or less valuable in society. So it could be a part of who you are, which is unfortunate. It could be a group that you choose to identify with, but it's something that is viewed negatively by others in some way. And so I'm going to talk about how to do resilience research that I think is appropriately connected to our lived experiences. We should think more about stigma in the resilience process. And then I'll share those tips and tricks for you all to hopefully use in your own everyday lives. So I'll give you a second to read this. This is a bunch of academic words to say Finding Nemo, just keep swimming. That is how I think about resilience. I think psychologically we can come up with strategies, and we can think about the resources we need. I think behaviorally we can continue to invest effort in the goals that we care about, and I like to focus on this definition of resilience that we published in our prior work, because I think it is more of what is under our control. Things that I think we often conflate and confuse with resilience are being successful. So you could not have yet hit your goal, but you could still be being resilient. You could, be complaining and saying, no, I'm not going to just take this and deal with it. That doesn't mean you're not resilient. And you could be really sad. You could be really frustrated, right? And that, again, does not mean you are not continuing to swim. And so I like to set the stage with that first. And this is my slide that's like, why is it so important that we're having these conversations, these sessions about resilience? I don't know anyone who hasn't had to overcome, right? We all at some point will experience life events that call on us to potentially be resilient. And then there is work showing that every single job and occupation has stressors like role overload, right? Where you're asked to do too many things for one person, or role ambiguity where it's not clear what's expected of you, or role conflict where you're asked to be in two places at once. And so those type of stressors are more common in some occupations and careers than others, but we all do have instances where resilience could help us in our life. Now, I'll give you a second to read this tweet that went viral during the pandemic. I want to first say, I feel sis. I feel this fully. I identify with it even as a resilience researcher. I think that we get it wrong sometimes, and we use the term resilience to exploit people. Again, to say, just deal with it, just take it, keep on going. And so comments and sentiments like this inspired a paper that we published in Harvard Business Review in 2022 about pitfalls that we are falling into in the way that we think about and talk about resilience. And in that paper, we presented certain probing questions that leaders could ask themselves to help avoid those pitfalls. So the first pitfall is thinking of resilience as a trait. Like you have it or you don't. It's just something that's in the individual. Now, when we decide that it is a trait that you have or you don't, why would we then develop systems of structure, and why would we change the adversity? Why would we make a shift in the environment if it's all up to individuals? So I think that we have to, and I'll talk about what my hope is in the way that we should be thinking about resilience. But that's the first pitfall. And the second pitfall is, again, stigmatizing people for needing a second, like needing a break, needing to feel all the human emotions that we all feel that help us get through. And so the probing questions that leaders could instead ask themselves, instead of being frustrated because employees are not machines, as we've learned in organizational psych, is, are all employees experiencing this adversity in the same way? And that one, it could be, we're noticing that one person is having a harder time getting through something. But the pandemic showed us, right? Like, it was a shared adversity, but the way that it showed up in our lives and affected each of us was very different. If you were a caregiver for an elderly parent, if you had school-age children, if you had a pre-existing health condition, all of that shifted what your resilience looked like, what your adversities looked like. And then I really hope that leaders going forward will ask themselves, what role can I play and making resilience more possible, making it easier for people to overcome, not just an intervention that says, this is what you need to do, but what can I do as your leader? And so some of the wonderful graduate students in my lab are here, and Sanu and Nick Banerjee and Sanu Jean-Baptiste published a paper about adaptive employee resilience. So one of the things that we often don't talk about is that we as a society stigmatize people when they aren't resilient. Although if being resilient is harming you, your physical, your mental health, or it's harming someone else, that's not the best option. So resilience, I don't think, is always the answer or should always be the go-to, but what we should aim for is adaptive and healthy forms of resilience. And yes, there are individual things that we can do. We can choose, healthier forms of coping. We can build up a reservoir of resources, a support system. And I want us to, as people who focus on and discuss resilience, also remember that organizations can do something too to build this adaptive resilience. So proactively, like I said, removing the adversities that can be removed. I often share that losing my grandmother was the hardest thing I've ever gone through. And nobody, sadly, as far as I know, can remove that adversity from my experience. But there are adversities that some of us face that could be addressed, that could be removed, right? Like some of those role stressors I talked about. And also, consistently providing employees resources along the way could help create an environment where resilience is more likely. And I'll give you a second to read this quote. So I like this quote because it highlights how resources are important for overcoming, not just who you are, but what you have access to. And we know in society that resources are not evenly distributed. And I would update this quote to say, we're actually not all in the exact same storm. And the examples I gave about the pandemic illustrate that the types of storms or characteristics of the storm may be different for some people. And what that might look like, if we think about stigma, is the experience of being stigmatized, right? Facing overt and subtle discrimination, unfortunately, sometimes internalizing the messages from society that say you are bad, you aren't good enough, something's wrong with your culture. All of those things contribute to concepts like imposter phenomenon, right, or stereotype threat. And so those are potential aspects of a storm that may be unique and different for some people. And so this is why I think it's so important that when we talk about resilience and overcoming, we don't approach it in an identity neutral or absent of thinking about stigma. And so another one of my graduate students is here, Elisa Fatarachi. And so this is a paper that we, myself and Elisa and some of our collaborators published in 2022, looking specifically at a type of stigma-related adversity that many people face, and that is microaggressions. So microaggressions are those subtle, ambiguous indignities that convey something negative is thought about you and or your group. And so in this study, we collected data from 345 full-time Black employees across the US, and we gave them some validated scales, and we asked them about their microaggression encounters at work. We asked them about certain forms of coping or how they were trying to be resilient, what they were doing to navigate in that environment, and then we looked at important work outcomes. We also asked them some open-ended questions, like what happened, who committed the microaggression, did you report it? Most people did not, sadly, and they often talked about, people won't believe me. They will re-traumatize me by saying it wasn't race-based, even though what they said was clearly rooted in racial stereotypes or racial history in this country. And so some of the things that we found, and I'll highlight, I know this is way too small, I'll just tell you, some of the things that we found were that there are many different types of microaggressions that are currently accepted and talked about. And for example, the over-sexualization of Black women has happened across history. And the more you are in an environment where that type of microaggression is happening, the more likely you are to also in that place engage in co-rumination. So rumination is where you think over and over about a situation, you replay it in your head. Co-rumination is when you do that with another person. So you say, like, I would say, am I tripping? Like, was that racist? Like, would they say that to me if I were not in this body? Like, what do you think about that? So trying to make sense of our environment and what's happening around us, which is effortful. It takes time. I would rather be focusing on my research and my work, right? Instead of trying to navigate those things, but when it's bothering me and it's happening, it's understandable that people are engaging in this. The other potential form of seeking resilience mechanism that we looked at was race-related vigilance. So that is avoiding certain situations, conversations that don't feel safe. Again, effortful, saying, oh, if that topic comes up, I need to leave. Or, okay, that person, I'm gonna smile and I'm gonna run away quickly with an excuse because I don't feel safe here. Again, effortful, and that was evidenced by the effects of, more vigilance in terms of our race in a context was related to greater burnout, but also better or higher job satisfaction. So it's how people are preserving their satisfaction in a space, but it's also leading to more burnout. And then finally, some of those other types of microaggressions involved low achievement. So people making comments or negative assumptions about your competence, which of course in a work context is very relevant and important. And so the more you experience low achievement types of microaggressions, the more you were engaging in this co-rumination and race-related vigilance. And then invisibility, which many people I'm sure have encountered this. It's where it's like people don't even see you, you don't exist in the space, or they're in your personal space like you're not there. That was related to lower job satisfaction, and also environmental microaggressions matter. So not seeing people who look like you in leadership, seeing a wall of images of pictures of people who are being idolized who look nothing like you, sending signals of who is valued and who is given certain opportunities in a place was also related to greater burnout and more vigilance. And so the last thing we also did in this study in understanding how even these subtle, right, like ambiguous forms of racism and stigmatization, how it's affecting people, we asked people to tell us stories. And so we wanted to understand how stigma is different across different identity groups. So we asked these Black employees, what was the microaggression experience, what happened? And it highlights how we need to think about this in an intersectional way to also think about gender and other identities that may be stigmatized. So for example, Black women talked about pathologizing your hair, physical attributes, right? People grabbing your hair or saying, you're gonna wear your hair like that to the client meeting, even though that is how your hair grows out of your head and there's nothing wrong with it. We saw Black men talking about, wearing a suit and walking across a college campus and being asked, like, you ready for the football game? And they're like, I'm a professor here. Why would you assume I'm on the football team? But the history of racism and slavery in this country has deemed Black bodies to be controlled and used for capitalistic gain. And so all of that is where this still manifests and shows up today, which is why when we talk about resilience and adversity and overcoming, we also should think about people's everyday lived experiences. And so all of that is related to the ongoing work we're doing in our resilience lab, where the SSRI Institute has given us some funding to do a longitudinal assessment of microaggressions, looking at how are people responding in the moment, how are they responding later, and what's most adaptive for their thriving and joy, not just resilience of returning to baseline, but really feeling happy, being able to be engaged, be creative, enjoy the work that you're doing. The career award that was mentioned is also all about that organizational role in creating environments where resilience is possible. So what are the organizational resources that actually help employees of color overcome identity-based traumas? And then we recently published a paper in American Psychologist that creates a framework for thinking about resilience and post-traumatic change, not growth, because I don't want to grow from racism and sexism. I will change, unfortunately. So thinking about post-traumatic change and resilience in light of our understanding of how stigma shows up in our life. Okay, so the last thing I will tell you in these 3 minutes is some tips and tricks, some strategies, some things we know from the resilience literature, and these are identity related and relevant. So I do not think there is a one-size-fits-all in terms of resilience interventions, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I also think there is utility in thinking about timing. So when something first happens, your emotions are high, right? When something first goes wrong and is challenging, or if something is done or said. And so in the moment, research has shown that things like emotional acceptance is helpful. So not beating yourself up for feeling frustrated or feeling upset, because that further depletes your resources to be mad that you're mad. So thinking about how can I accept my emotions in this moment and then decide how I would like to proceed. And also, if you think about identity-related stigma, it's valuable to know that the coping literature talks about emotion-focused coping, which is trying to feel more positive emotion, and problem-focused coping, which is trying to address the thing that called on you to cope. Now, with isms, I think it's very valuable to not engage in emotion-focused coping. I don't need to feel happy after racism and sexism and intersectional issues. I need to think about, okay, what is the problem here? What can be done about it? And that's why research is part of my coping. And then soon after something goes wrong, there are things that you can do psychologically. Research has shown that collective self-esteem, so feeling good about the groups that you're a part of, particularly when society tells you you shouldn't, can help bolster you against adversity and burnout and negative outcomes like exhaustion and depression. And then it's really important in the resilience space to recognize your unique needs. So I hate bubble baths. I don't like journaling. Like everything that people say will make you more resilient isn't for everybody. So trying out different things, figuring out what works for you is also part of psychologically helping you to be resilient. And then finally, there is research showing that advocacy, collective support, knowing that you're not alone, engaging in this problem-focused coping with other people is really helpful for our resilience. Work recovery shows that when we leave our job, things like exercise, eating food that makes us feel better, not worse, trying to get sleep, although microaggressions harm sleep, trying to get sleep when we can, and then also learning reflection. So some of the work we've done shows that if you view making mistakes as part of learning versus a horrible thing, if you feel like you have to always be perfect, that's actually counter to your resilience. So realizing like I can learn from this, I can adapt, I can grow, helps us to be more resilient. And the last thing I'll tell you is that resilience is hard, right? It literally means something has gone wrong. There is a problem here. And so some of the good parts, or the silver lining here, is that as we are resilient, we learn these adaptation skills, and that is a lifelong process, right? I can think back to when my grandmother passed, what did I do so that the next time something really huge and unfortunate happens, I can draw on those skills. And I also think that personally being resilient and facing adversity helps me prioritize what matters most. It becomes very clear to me, as many of us probably in the pandemic, what's really important, how to protect our peace, and how to thrive in our lives. And those are my references. Thank you.
So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about disaster, and specifically I'm talking about disaster narratives. And I want to just give a brief note about the content. I am going to be sharing some The talk that I'm giving today includes brief mentions of racial violence and discrimination, and I just want to encourage everyone to take care of yourself. If you're not in the headspace for that today, I totally understand. So ever since Hurricane Harvey, I've been collecting narratives about flooding in particular. I have a project which is called the Houston Flood Museum, which is not a physical museum. There's no building. It's a project. It's really just the name I give to a set of research questions I ask about the connections between human activity and catastrophic flooding, especially as linked to wealth inequality and racial disparity. So the Houston Flood Museum has a website where we occasionally exhibit some of these narratives. I supervise research assistants. In particular, I want to acknowledge Jayla Solomon and Maddie Lacy, who've been really helpful this year in helping me locate some of the materials I'm going to be talking about today. They have been working to assemble a bibliography of popular literature about flooding, and a couple of years ago, we collected first-person narratives about flooding and paired them with really artfully rendered, beautifully illustrated maps, and that's our atlas, our Houston Flood Atlas, called More City Than Water. What I can tell you about having done this work since Harvey is there are a lot of stories about flooding in Houston. Not just because of Harvey. Houston has flooded as long as there has been a Houston, and of course even before. And it flooded for the first time, I think, 13 months after it was bought by the Allen brothers. But the flood I actually want to begin with today is the storm of 1900, when a Category 4 hurricane struck Galveston and a 15-foot storm surge inundated the island, killing thousands and thousands of people. The estimates range from between 6,000 people to 12,000 people. Almost 40,000 people lived on the island at the time. And so even though there were mass casualties, it was also very well documented in newspapers and diaries and letters. One letter from an Alice Black, a young woman named Alice Black, dated September 16th, 1900, offers a first-person account. Quote, "My dear Jenny," she writes, "within this last week I have passed through the most trying experience of my life. You have no idea of the havoc, distress, and dislocation that can be caused by wind and water." Alice Black and her family, according to this letter, lived 2 blocks from the beach. The storm surge began arriving around 1 a.m. on September 8th, and by 5 a.m. had filled the first floor of their house. They took shelter on the 2nd floor. The house eventually fell on its side, and Alice and her parents climbed out the window and swam through the floodwaters, taking shelter on the floating roof of another house. Her mother was hit in the head by debris. Her father was struck in the chest, which knocked him unconscious, and she held his body on the roof with her. And if she hadn't, she writes, he would have drowned. Eventually, they were rescued off the roof, and several days later, when Alice is writing the letter to her friend, she says that she needs to find work if there's any hope of recovery. Alice had planned to substitute in the schools, but who knows when they will reopen. She's planning to work in a store for a few days. Quote, "It is absolutely necessary for me to do something in our present destitute condition," she writes. In letters like this one, and in newspapers and diaries, writers narrate the ways disasters has completely disrupted what might be considered the normal order of things. Not just the natural order, but the social and political order as well. In another letter, dated September 19th, a different woman, Regina, writes to her father that during the storm, roofs flew through the air like stringless kites, and telephone poles were snapped like tobacco pipes. She recounts that the thousands of dead bodies are creating a public health crisis, and that the response so far has been to bury them hastily at sea. Spoilers, that didn't work. They all washed back on shore. There isn't time or observation of any of the usual funerary rites, no clergy to issue last rites. There is a reluctance on the part of some of the citizens to help, Regina writes. They have been compelled to do so at the muzzle of the rifle. It is well documented that in the immediate aftermath of the 1900 storm, white citizens were impressed into militias and imposed martial law. White vigilantes falsely accused black residents of looting and killed them. White political leaders and businessmen forced black men at gunpoint to clear debris and bury the dead. In this report from September 12th, 4 days after the storm, the writer makes a point to note that the better class of citizen is laboring side by side with the, quote, Negro and the poor white man. But relief efforts were aimed mainly at this better class of citizens. Black residents, indigenous residents, poor white residents, those who tended to live nearer to the shore and were disproportionately harmed by the storm. They were forced to work for the recovery of the city, but were not included in that recovery themselves. And they were left to organize for their own relief and aid. Black Houstonians in particular placed a series of newspaper ads to call one another into the relief effort for their neighbors in Galveston. Quote, in the hour of affliction and distress in Galveston, we, knowing the conditions existing there, call upon the members of our race throughout the country to organize for the relief of the storm-stricken sufferers. By September 15th, the Houston Daily Post reports that the town is steadying under the influence of the efforts being made by the persons in charge of various parts of the relief work, and at every point may be seen evidence of the fact that the worst is over. The people are calmer. They no longer roam around aimlessly, expending much energy and accomplishing nothing. There is now a controlling force in the machinery by which order is being slowly restored and work is being done, work that is now predictive of results. People didn't really use the term resilience at that time, not like we do now as it relates to disaster resilience in particular. But from our perspective in the present, we can see that this is maybe what's happening here. There's an effort to put back in place what existed before, including, unfortunately, racial and economic hierarchies. In the aftermath of the storm and under the guise of rebuilding, white city leaders formed a commission-style government to oversee the rebuilding effort. The most notable accomplishment of that commission was to pass measures to construct a seawall and raise the grade of the island in order to protect it from future storms. But by featuring at-large districts, this form of government successfully excluded Black residents from representation and ensured that they would always be outnumbered in future elections. And the commission-style government became a model for city governments across the nation, including right here in Houston. A year after the storm, newspapers boasted about Galveston's economic recovery. On September 12, 1901, the Austin Statesman wrote a congratulatory editorial. Quote, no city of modern times has suffered such a catastrophe as Galveston. And following upon the heels of the storm, it seemed well-nigh a hopeless task to rebuild the ruined city. Outside aid and business energy on the part of the citizens of Galveston have brought about order out of chaos, bless you, have rebuilt from the ruins of the storm the modern mansions of beauty. The future of Galveston is the future of Texas. At that time, at the turn of the 20th century, Houston had grown into a minor port for cotton, sugar, and lumber, boasting, by the way, that it was the capital of all of these industries, which sounds familiar. And it might have continued on that way as a self-aggrandizing regional port, drying up the way many cities did when resources eventually depleted. But then the hurricane leveled Galveston in 1900, and 4 months after the storm, prospectors discovered a gusher at Spindletop so large that its reserves seemed bottomless. That discovery brought oil companies, and the companies built refineries, and the proliferation of the internal combustion engine produced a demand for gasoline. By 1935, half of all Texas oil moved through the Houston Ship Channel. In December 1935, a 2-day downpour flooded Houston. Water filled the downtown up to the second-floor windows. It flooded at least 100 residential blocks and clogged the Houston Ship Channel downstream with mud and debris, shutting it down for 8 months. Bridges were underwater, houses were underwater, people stood on their roofs waiting for rescue. The yellow cab company downtown caught on fire, and firefighters pumped the floodwater that was in the street up onto the roof to put out the fire. It's not funny, but the photographs are interesting. It's just interesting that I'm laughing. Okay, the post office was destroyed, downtown buildings collapsed, the docks of the ship channel were completely submerged. In footage of the damage taken by an amateur filmmaker, dock workers pulled debris, sticks, clothing, a door, all out of the floodwater. A sailor even retrieves a massive stalk of bananas covered in oil. Newspapers shared what may feel to some of us who lived through Harvey like familiar accounts of people who owned boats journeying out into the floodwaters to rescue flood victims, and doing so without expectation of remuneration or reward. There are many accounts of everyday heroism, and newspapers particularly point out moments when that heroism overcomes class and race divisions. And these may also feel familiar to us as official narratives of the storm. One reporter recounts, women sobbed because their homes and their cherished possessions were being ruined. Children perched atop their father's shoulders cried because their mothers cried or because they were afraid. Men with grim faces piled what household possessions they could manage on their heads and climbed toward higher ground. But in a line here and there are brief mentions at the back of the paper. For example, it becomes clear that in this storm, like so many others, that the damage wasn't equal. It was disproportionate. And just Black residents in particular were disproportionately affected. Hundreds of Black residents had to be evacuated from their flooded homes and were turned away from white relief facilities. The downtown business district was damaged, but the Black business district was completely destroyed. Of the 7 casualties who died in the storm, 5 were Black children. There's an editorial on the front page of the Houston Chronicle a day after the floodwaters crested. Clothing is needed, the editors write. Funds too are needed. It is too soon yet to estimate the total, but at least several $1,000s must be had if homeless families are to be re-established in a condition comparable to that which they knew prior to the flood. In a condition comparable to that which they knew prior to the flood. Again, they're not using the term resilience because it predates our usage of that term, but the idea is there. The idea of bouncing back and restoring the natural, normal social order. And one of the things I find fascinating about that is the extent to which city officials were willing to alter the natural order of the environment in order to preserve the social and economic order of the city. In this same editorial, the editors called for attention to flood prevention. And a month after the storm, the Port of Houston director, J. Russell White, was blaming the flood on the smallness of Buffalo Bayou. He told the Houston Chronicle, "This last flood definitely proved that Buffalo Bayou alone cannot handle the tremendous volume of water which a flood pours into it." White, again, who was the port director at the time, he helped to author this 1937 report to the Texas legislature that declared a public emergency due to the constant menace of the bayous overflowing with each heavy rain. Millions of dollars in private, municipal, and other government capital investments depend solely upon the vagaries of nature, the authors complained. Traffic and commerce are constantly in danger of disruption on the Great Houston Ship Channel. The Texas legislature agreed, and in order to protect against the constant menace of flooding, created the Flood Control District and empowered it with the authority to take on large-scale flood mitigation projects with the Army Corps of Engineers. Congress subsequently approved construction of 2 reservoirs along Buffalo Bayou, Addicks Reservoir, which you can see in there, and Barker Reservoir. They were built on tens of thousands of acres far west of what was then the extreme outer reaches of the city. Those reservoirs, the construction was completed in 1945 and 1948, but in the interval, the city had flooded 3 more times. When the flooding continued, even with the reservoirs, in 1949, in 1950, 1957, and 1959, the Flood Control District sent engineers with backhoes and dredges to widen and straighten and deepen the bayous, transforming their tight bends and oxbows into smooth, straight lines. They cleared all the trees and shrubs and paved the banks in concrete. They let nothing enter them but water, let nothing grow above the concrete but tightly mown grass. They called this process channel rectification. And again, they didn't use this word at the time, but perhaps the idea was that this would make the city more resilient to flooding. Unfortunately, as several of our esteemed colleagues have observed, in many cases that has actually made the flooding worse. I would say that resilience as a category of response to disaster didn't emerge until the latter part of the 20th century. And I know that you showed this engram in your talk too, and I'm not going to say that I stole it from you, but I was inspired. So it didn't emerge until the latter part of the 20th century, when disaster ceased to be an exceptional experience and instead began to become a feature of actually normal life. As climate-fueled disasters became more common and more severe, resilience became the dominant framework in disaster analysis and policy. The idea that some communities or systems or societies are more able to resist, absorb, and recover from hazards than others. And if resilience is an ability, the argument seems to go, perhaps it can be fostered, developed, and grown so that not every hazard we encounter has to become a disaster. And on here, I know it's very small, but I just want to point out really quickly, I love etymology. It's one of my most favorite things. And resilient, of course, in its original meaning means to rebound or to jump back. And it gets this jumping meaning from one of the root words, which is salient. And I love the idea down here at the very bottom that salient point refers to the heart of an embryo, which seems to leap, and it suggests the starting point of anything. My starting point was Hurricane Harvey, so it seems a good place to return to think about this question of resilience. So 61 inches of rain fell in some places, 19 trillion gallons, enough to compress the earth 2 centimeters under the entire metro region. It has been called the greatest rainfall event in North America in recorded history. A third of the city flooded, nearly 200,000 homes. Like all the other disasters I've mentioned here, that damage disproportionately fell on poor communities and communities of color. For weeks afterward, many people helped in the ways that we knew how. By volunteering, by organizing, by collecting donations. Newspapers and magazines and radio programs told and retold those familiar stories of everyday heroism. And these stories have become the official stories of the storm. The story of sacrifice and resilience, of working together for the common good. Houston Strong is maybe that story's shortest version. We repeat these stories because we like what they say about us as a community and as about people. But these stories aren't complete, and they're only partially true. As I began collecting stories about the storm in 2017, I also came across the story of a man whose house, built up on a raised foundation above the street level, did not flood at the end of a street where every other house went underwater. The day after the flood receded, when his neighbors were allowed back to their homes, he sat on his porch with a gun over his knee and aimed it at anyone who tried to park in front of his driveway. I heard, too, the story of a single mother in Houston Gardens who was living in a tent in her yard because she had been denied assistance by FEMA. She was trying to muck out the house herself to make it livable again before volunteers finally arrived to help. But when a friend's home flooded on the other side of the town in Meyerland, which is predominantly affluent and white, her family received help from FEMA, and within days, a team of contract laborers were swinging hammers and putting her house and her life back into place. These stories and the inequality they represent also tell us who we are as a community and as people. So when we talk about resilience, about repairing these ruptures to normal life, I guess that maybe one intellectual snag for me is how this idea of bouncing back, or maybe even a bouncing forward, is that when we are repairing what is normal, normal also contains the conditions that produced these disparate experiences of the disaster. And bouncing back without repairing that may actually be working to preserve underlying systemic issues and vulnerabilities. But in the aftermath of the storm, I also came across stories of people working to address those underlying systemic issues and to lift up communities while also addressing the conditions that harmed them in the first place. In the aftermath of Harvey, an organization called West Street Recovery formed in response to the gap between available recovery assistance and recovery need. West Street connects residents who need repairs with residents who can do those repairs. And in an essay for our collection, More City Than Water, one of the founders, this guy named Ben Hirsch, writes about the formation of the organization in the wake of the storm and explains that in their organizing work, they wanted to avoid the flaws they saw in the way major aid organizations distributed assistance. Noting how they saw mountains of food fenced in with armed guards standing by, how churches use police escorts to deliver Wonder Bread and peanut butter, and how one agency's application for assistance included an agreement to be drug tested. Disasters not only prompt a humanitarian and altruistic response, he writes, they also create ruptures in our standard way of operating. And we can repair these ruptures. And we can also maybe see them as invitations to ask, why is the world this way? Working closely with with West Street Recovery, another organization called the Northeast Action Collective emerged partially in response to this question, why is the world this way? The Northeast Action Collective focuses on direct action and advocacy to improve the lives and neighborhoods of their members who have suffered from a long history of flooding, institutional racism, and infrastructural neglect. Members learn to share their testimony, so their stories and their demands at government meetings, with the media, and they use them to mobilize their friends, neighbors, and community networks. They conduct focus groups and do community interviews to write reports advocating for the essential protections from flooding and to demand a say in the infrastructure that impacts their health and ability to live. In their 2021 report, Survivors as Experts, the authors acknowledge that the story arc of a sudden event and recovery doesn't match the reality of historical neglect, constant environmental risk, health stress, and financial pressure that characterizes residents' actual lives. As the Northeast Action Collective co-founder Doris Brown explains, quote, we're living in disaster all the time. We have learned how to exist in disaster. We never really recover. Pollution, methane gas. It's going to take a lot for us to ever recover. To have a more equitable community, we need to solve those underlying problems. I would say this is also resilience, but not the kind of resilience that seeks to resolve the disruption of the disastrous by restoring what is normal. Rather, it fundamentally disrupts what is normal. It challenges what we have come to consider normal. This kind of resilience seeks to learn and grow and transform the root causes of underlying systemic problems that brought the disaster to their doorsteps in the first place. And maybe this narrative of transformation, not recovery, offers some lessons about how to build a more just and equitable future. Thank you.